Hello and welcome everyone this evening to this discussion on the Heartland theory by Halford Mackinder. Something different for the channel. It's the first time that there has been an episode dedicated directly to geopolitics. Indeed, not just Mackinder as a thinker, but also the whole notion of geopolitics as a discipline. But it shouldn't be too incongruous to the stuff you expect in this channel, because of course, all the things that are going to be brought up this evening intersect with so much of the history that I've gone into at great length, especially Russian history. In particular, one video from a couple of years ago, where I looked at the Russo-Japanese War as the greatest Russian defeat. You can say that this is an addendum in many ways to the my thinking behind the appellation of that that title upon Russia's defeat. I'm very lucky to be joined by a regular guest of the stream, Semigog. Hello.
Hello, sir. Very happy to be here. Thanks very much for having me on.
And a new guest on the channel, but I'm sure many of you will already be very familiar with Morgoth here. Morgoth's Review has a great YouTube channel. He also has a Substack. He has a very established presence on Twitter. He and I have followed each other's works for many, many years now. In many cases, we're actually responding directly to one another's works. But I've been on your channel once a long time ago. I think it was to discuss the historical accuracy of the film Cromwell. So it's quite interesting that now I have you on to talk about Halford Mackinder in terms of a complete juxtaposition of subjects. But nevertheless, Morgoth, hello.
Hello, and thanks for having me on. Big fan of the channel.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons I really wanted to get you involved in particular is that I'm familiar with your work on Mackinder. So I'd like to ask you first, how are you familiar with this particular thinker? Just for reference, Halford Mackinder is a geographer and a political theorist from the turn of the century. He writes or rather, he delivers his lecture, The Geographical Pivot of History, in 1904, then follows that up with The Democratic Ideals and Reality, series of essays and books in 1919. But how is it that you became familiar with Mackinder?
I think, well, I knew of Heartland theory, but I think it was rattled around in my mind as a theory which had its day because of interballistic, continental ballistic missiles and nuclear bombs and jet fighters, that the grand sort of open space, the infinite space of the steppes had been shrunk and it didn't matter anymore. And so it was a sort of theory which was been and gone, and that it didn't matter anymore. I think it may have been in Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. I could be wrong about that, but I came across it somewhere in a more recent historical book where it was kind of snubbed and sort of rendered it's out of date was the idea. And then when you get the Ukraine war, I began to hear people like Alex Mercouris refer to it again. And he was saying that this is the foreign policy and always has been the foreign policy of first the British and then they passed it over to the Americans. And I thought that was quite interesting, and I began to look at it again. And as soon as you look at the famous map, when you go on Google Images, because I remember the map. I remember there was a kind of weird science fiction sort of element to the map. And then I noticed straight away that the sort of the periphery of Heartland went straight through Ukraine and right through the middle of it. And I thought, oh, right, I see this. And so it put a bit of a different spin on it, and I revisited it again. And it coincided. I mean, somebody was saying, don't waffle on about Spengler, but it coincided with another thing I was looking at the time, which was an essay by Oswald Spengler on Russia. And he viewed the next great civilization would take place in Russia or on the steppe. And I began to, so it kind of rhymed and it kind of came together. And I began to take Heartland theory much more seriously and kind of used it and tested it out as a tool of analysis until eventually I came to the conclusion that actually he, despite the sort of rockets and missiles and long-range bombers, it didn't actually seem to matter. Like it's still the same fight happening again. It seems perfectly relevant, and it also puts a kind of framework where if you think the say the West in this case, or as they call it, the collective West, it gives a sort of strategic logic to what they're doing, why it is that they're so interested in Ukraine rather than, for let's say, they're all just crazy warmongers and or the various other theories that go around. But of course, then you get to think, well, are they familiar with this theory, or is it embedded within the security apparatus as a sort of received wisdom? And so this is where I began to kind of really reread it. I read the original book by Mackinder. So that's kind of a background to how I came to this.
It's quite interesting. You mentioned many things that we'll cover, and hopefully in more depth. One, of course, is the assumption by Alexander Makuris, who I think we can all agree is a rather Russian sympathetic outlet operating in London. Another, of course, is looking at this idea of Mackinder as received wisdom for the Foreign Office and the way that we approach the whole situation with Russia. Another is looking at the geography of Ukraine. As for why I believe the theory has been, quote unquote, outmoded or whatever, which you also bring up, there are several elements to it. One is the idea that Mackinder focuses a lot on land routes. In particular, this is the time of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So a lot of the dismissals towards the theory are directed against that this is no longer the case. We need to look at things like asymmetrical warfare and technological innovation. Another element to it is actually damnation by association, which is that his works influence one German realpolitiker in the 1920s, Karl Haushofer, who then went on to influence the Lebensraum position of the German National Socialist Party, and later National Socialist Germany. That's actually an interesting angle, because I believe that damnation by association is actually looking at it completely the wrong way around. But nevertheless, that's an important element to it. There is actually one thing I wanted to bring up, which is you sent me this image of the Soviet Project 903 before now, and I just wondered, why in particular have you chosen to associate this image with the Heartland theory?
Because if you've got this purely land-based, again, it goes back to the Spengler sort of thesis on this, which I don't want to sort of mention again, because people will say that's all I talk about. But basically, if you this kind of spirit of the Russian steppe, where it's sort of the endless horizon above the steppes. And so instead of having airplanes going sort of 5 miles high, you get this idea where everything's just flat and it goes on forever on all sides. And in this case, this prototype, it barely sort of left this. I think they designed it to go sort of skim across the top of the Caspian. And eventually they wanted to have these things sort of just going over the steppe on little cushions of air. And it would have been like this unique form of travel, particular to the Soviet Union, or to in case of, say, this geographic location, if you want to put it in those terms, to keep it in the stream. And then what you would begin to see is that you can have this kind of futuristic look at what it would be like to have a vast sort of dominant power, an empire based entirely on land with its own sort of metaphysic and its own logic. And it has like more or less a complete indifference to sea routes and choke points and all of the rest of it. And it's purely about this. I think you can, we'll probably come into this later, but I think you can see elements of this with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think I can imagine sort of where everything is just going across land on super high tech railways, which are going like 400 miles an hour, or, you know, all of this, where everything is orientated towards getting across massive expanses of land rather than going into space, rather than traveling the sea and worrying about sea lanes. And it would have it would kind of create a whole different form of civilization if they can pull it off, of course, because you are still going to have the sea powers trying to cause trouble. But I just thought it was kind of emblematic of somebody, of a way of thinking which is different and rooted in endless flat surfaces.
And yes, you specified the aesthetic, and I very much agree with you on the on the aesthetic front, especially as it also incorporates something that Mackinder was not aware of in 1904, which is the nature of air power as well, and how such a theory could be applied, at least aesthetically, to the idea of the land view of geopolitics and history. But Oliver, I wanted to ask you the same question. How did you come across Mackinder?
Well, I've long been into geopolitics. A friend of mine gave me a book years ago, which I recommend heartily to everyone. It's called The Strategic Atlas, long out of print now, third edition, A Comparative Geopolitics of the World's Powers by one Gérard de Chalian and Jean-Pierre Rago. And in it, I first came across a listing of some of these major geopolitical thinkers. You've got early ones like Mackinder, Mahan, and you've got others like Ratzel and Kielen, Ratzel's student, both of them deriving much of their thought from groundwork laid by Ritter, and of course Kielen and Ratzel and this whole line of thinking that we can sort of call the German geostrategic thinking. Haushofer, whom you mentioned, they owe some, to some extent, some of them, the later ones, owe their thinking on the matter to Spengler, certainly insofar as they discuss the will to life of a nation, the idea of Raum or Lebensraum that you mentioned earlier. And then, of course, the sort of Anglo dimensions of it, Mahan, whom I see basically as a kind of tool for British geopolitical interests, insofar as arguably Roosevelt the First, Theodore, was also sort of in that category, Mackinder, and then Speakman later. So I got into that and the reading of maps, particularly odd projections that we don't normally see, comparing map projections produced in different countries. You know, so the map that you look at on the wall of a schoolroom in China or in the United States or in Britain, they're all going to be quite different. And so how you look at these maps, what the projections show best versus other aspects that they might elide or conceal, that became a great interest to me. You know, you can't, just looking at this projection, you can't really make sense of the importance of the Arctic strategically, you know, for example. All of that was very, very interesting to me. But then when the business started in Ukraine, I believe it was someone on Twitter back in the day who pointed out to me that I should look at the Polish statesman, military figure, and strategic thinker Piłsudski and his idea of Prometheism. And much as Morgoth was talking about, saying, it's rather odd that the Heartland has one gate coming in through Eastern Europe, which led figures like Mackinder and then Speakman to talk about the importance of Eastern Europe as a gateway to the heartland. Then I began to think, well, it's rather odd that Prometheism, with the idea of the 3 Seas initiative, it's really about seizing control of Russian access to the Baltic and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So I began to realize that Prometheism is entirely premised on the idea of the heartland theory, or the developments of it later by Speakman. And there is certainly no doubt that comes down as received wisdom from the period of the Cold War through figures like Brzezinski, who argued very strongly for Prometheism, which is a kind of combination of hemming in Russia from rimland positions, as Speakman would refer to them, this marginal crescent area, as well as attempting to lock in that part of Eastern Europe where peninsular Europe is at its narrowest point in terms of the immediate region where it adjoins Russia, that being from Kaliningrad in the north all the way down to another area that Russia has maintained control of, Transnistria. So you see these sort of 2 pincers that Russia refused to give up even after the fall of the Soviet Union, which give them a sort of 2 points to start with if they wanted to close those pincers in order to pinch off the European peninsula, if you will. So I had always been into the geopolitics, but the story of these different figures from Ritter all the way up to Speakman and Haushofer became more interesting to me as I began to follow contemporary events more closely. And lastly, I should just say and perhaps we can get into this later, heartland theory is essentially British strategic thinking. And I can underscore, and perhaps we can get to it later, some ways in which you don't have to look at the world that way. And I think to the extent that it is British geostrategic thinking, and it has been carried over to the United States, I think that shows the way in which the same people who were behind the scenes in terms of British Empire, British power projection, and the rest remain behind the scenes today in the United States, which is not to say that, King Charles is in charge of the United States or something, or that secretly everything is run out of the city of London. But the general thinking about how to approach power projection and global control to the extent it can be affected is very much a British inheritance.
Can I speak to that? Because both of you have mentioned Russia. By and large, that involves, you can say there's an implication there. When you speak of Russia, you mean the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which are not just Russia, but involve a whole vast landmass, which roughly corresponds to a sixth of the world's surface, which also roughly corresponds to the pivot area, if you take in the influence concession from the Russo-Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1907. But you mentioned it being a English outlook. And this is where I'm going to turn that argument in its head here, because you're correct. But it's English in the sense that the enemy isn't Russia. The enemy is Europe. The enemy is Germany. And if you read into Mackinder extensively, his hatred of Germany and his historical revisionism could make Winston Churchill blush in terms of trying to understand that position. So when you look at things like you mentioned Prometheism, that really, you can say, is a derivative of Mackinder. It doesn't come from Mackinder himself, in the same way that pan-Turkism, which is something else that you and I have discussed at length, Oliver, is something that was contemporaneous with Mackinder, but nevertheless, it does not inform Mackinder in the way that, say, for example, Pilsudski meant Prometheism. And you talk about Speakman, and we talk about containment doctrine. And again, you can say that is the American inheritance of Mackinder. And you can really say that Speakman is interesting in the sense that as an antecedent of Kissinger, we're now making it more Russo-centric rather than European-centric, and that is with the mind to containing not just the geostrategic threat of Russia, but also containing the expansion of communism, which by the time that we have the rise of communism, Mackinder, you can say, has fallen from the limelight. When he's speaking in 1918, 1919, when he's speaking of democratic ideals, he's speaking of the ideological and strategic fraternity that binds the countries of France, Britain, and America together in terms that you would find easily recognizable to anyone who talks about the collective West and democracy versus the quote-unquote Oriental despotisms of Austria-Hungary, of Prussia, the Prussian monarchy, and of course of Russia. All of this is deeply embedded in the work of Mackinder. And indeed, you mentioned Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an American naval officer, admiral, who wrote his famous on the influence of sea power, with specific reference to the British and the American empires in the 17th and the 18th century. Yes, it had a huge amount of influence on British and American thinkers, in particular due to the overriding sort of concern towards maintaining the blockade on Germany during World War I, the naval blockade. But also it was incredibly influential to the German Kaiser. So much so you can say that Mahan actually had more of an effect on the zeitgeist in Germany in the 1890s and 1900 than it perhaps did beyond, you can say, the more strategic thinking circles in Britain and the United States. And that one makes it fascinating. And I'll talk about the specificity of looking at Germany and Europe as the enemy rather than Russia in Mackinder's thinking. Because just to explain what the Heartland theory is in very brief terms, because we haven't gone over the specifics, what Mackinder is referring to is the end of what he refers to as the Columbian epoch, and this has many meanings which he wasn't aware of when he first used that terminology. But by the Columbian epoch, he roughly means that this is the end of the era of exploration that begins with Columbus in 1492. We found Australia, we found the Arctic, we've now found the Antarctic. There is no landmass for which to lay claim to. In other words, the world has evolved from an open system where there are still new territories and lands to conquer, to a closed system with definite understanding of political geography. And this is where it comes to this idea of the pivot. Within this worldview, naval powers have always had the dominance because they've been able to take advantage of these areas on the periphery, whether it be directly with someone like Australia or indirectly with someone like South America, and Britain maintaining effectively the American-inspired Monroe Doctrine. And here it comes to the idea of the pivot. When we have geographic certainties, when we understand that there is no new vast landmass out there that, say, for example, can create a new version of the Spanish Empire in the 20th century, then we look at the potentialities of Russia in particular. We look at the potentialities of the Eurasian landmass. We look at it as the world island, and that being incontrovertibly the largest stretch of land in terms of the amount of influence that one can wield through controlling it. And then it comes this idea that with that assumption, with that basic assumption of the relative strengths and population centers of these various landmasses, then it comes this idea of the pivot. We've had the dominance of sea power in the Columbian epoch, but with the certainties of a closed world system, we can now understand the potentialities of somewhere like Russia. And in this case, the pivot area, the heartland, becomes the ultimate citadel of land power. And for Mackinder, you take the heartland, you combine it with manpower, which is another major innovation of the 19th and 20th centuries. Manpower, as it so happens, is coined by Mackinder. Then we add to that logistics, which the reason I brought up the idea of the Soviet Project 903 that you brought to my attention, Morgoth, is the idea again that all of these vast land masses can be traversed in a way and made navigable in a way that was seemingly impossible, especially if we look at the old river arteries of Siberia, which were closed off for most of the year. And then you add in something which is not necessarily congruent with focusing specifically on Russian supremacy of the control of this particular area, but on adding to this naval supremacy. It's an old Napoleonic argument, and again, it should be mentioned that the sequel to Mahan's work was The Influence on Sea Power and the French Revolution between 1795 and 1812. This idea that if there is no major land power from which to thwart that which basically indirectly or directly controls the heartland, his idea was Germany, then there will be unlimited time for them to pool those resources together and build a fleet that can threaten the quote-unquote democratic nations of the West vis-a-vis the Oriental despotisms. And what he clearly has in mind is the German high seas fleet. So you mentioned, Mongol, this idea of this aesthetic of being focused, solely on the land. But you can say that so much of Mackinder's argument is actually predicated on long-termism, i.e., it doesn't matter if you have temporary naval supremacy. If you have the heartland, if you have manpower, and if you have logistics, then naval supremacy will naturally emanate out of that. And he goes into various historical examples. He looks at the rise of Macedon. He looks at the rise of this quote-unquote barbarian land power from the north during the time of Philip and later Alexander the Great, how it was able to take on the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, subdue Athens, even though his history is sometimes often confused, I would say. And then he's able to take the island city of Tyre from the Phoenicians, which basically ensured again that sea power was overcome by superior land power. And he also comes and makes very early, and I would say very dubious examples with regards to Hellas and Mycenae versus Crete and the insular sea peoples and things like that. Again, you have to understand that when we're talking about his historical initiatives, we're looking at this as someone who has all the information available to someone in the early 20th century, not necessarily with the benefit of hindsight with regards to everything we understand about the Bronze Age collapse, etc., etc., etc. So we have this quintessential argument that it's about Russia, it's about Ukraine. But like I said, if you employ the British thinking, the explicit British thinking, the sort of thinking that got us involved in the First World War in the first place, and then you combine this to the fears, the anxieties around the German high seas fleet, the Tirpitz plan, the idea of pooling all of these naval resources in one area around Wilhelmshaven to Hamburg, then all of a sudden you can understand why the British were invested, say, for example, in ensuring that there was no situation whereby Russia and Germany could ever be united. And this is why I think I would say, the ultimate legacy and the true reason why understanding Mackinder is so important, because more fundamental than just simply controlling the heartland or allying with the heartland basically ensures that we look at the Anglo-American alliance, and this is something building off what you also said, Semyagog, about it becoming essentially American thinking. Well, like I said, the Americans were more than willing to receive this message. And in that sense, the end of the Columbian epoch becomes a threat directed against the post-Columbian nations within the Americas, explicitly America, i.e. it is incumbent on us to defend this Columbian epoch away from the Eurasian pivot back towards somewhere like Russia, and domination being predicated on the preponderance of this empire emerging out of the pivot area in particular. And if you understand that, then American and British foreign policy becomes focused on detaching Europe or Germany from Russia or the Soviet Union, in the same way that Mackinder was also obsessed with the potentialities of China, because a Russian-China alliance would allow for the Asia pivot and the heartland being connected to a major ocean outlet. And you mentioned, Morgoth, the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. In that sense, again, Mackinder was ahead of his time in understanding the potentialities for China when he was writing this. This is geographic determinism, basically, because politically, when he was writing this, China was a basket case and controlled by European powers. But nevertheless, 120 years after writing this, we can actually see there is some validity in Mackinder's thinking in terms of the perils of associating the pivot area, the heartland, being allied to states on the periphery, or what Speakman would refer to as the rimland, whereby you can gain access to the sea and potentially threaten the Columbian epoch, i.e. the Anglo-American alliance. So just some thoughts, because like I said, it's seldom presented to me in that light. But I think if you begin to look at it in terms of the fears of alliance, so much as the fears of a monotonous empire as a monolith, it becomes all that more interesting to consider.
Semigar, you got anything? Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, considering the mid-century Germans, if you just throw that into the basic mix, where then you have the strange scenario from Mackinder's analysis, because if it's meant to contain Germany, but then we see that with the mid-century Germans, you get this truly revolutionary position where the mid-century Germans actually invade the heartland and try to conquer it. And you can see that that would have been a sort of all hands on deck nightmare scenario from the Anglo Alliance, because then you've got them on their doorstep, but it's kind of like inverting how you would see the heartland theory, where a country on the periphery, on the rim, actually invades the heartland, which isn't a sea power, it isn't an Anglo, and tries to go for broke and sort of take all the chips on the table. A risky proposition, but if they had pulled it off, it would have spent. I can understand why, beyond the usual reasons. It was just truly a nightmare scenario for the Anglo Alliance, the sea powers.
Well, as you can see on this map, this is actually a map I used for another stream, which was focusing on the forgotten Germans, the Eastern Germans, which were ethnically cleansed following World War II for this exact reason. But Mackinder focuses a lot on, you can say, rivers and the potential demarcation points of European geography. One such demarcation point, he believes, is the Volga River. And of course, as you can see on this map, we have a vast enclave of Russian-based Germans around Saratov and what was then called Engels and the Volga River, the Volga Germans. And for Mackinder, and this is actually why, like I said, in a bizarre way, he has been politically outmoded for this, because he was thinking about the enemy using this. He was thinking about this from the point of view of someone who saw Germany as the overarching enemy. But nevertheless, the Germans thought, actually, no, he's given us an idea. He has basically projected this idea onto us, which didn't really occur to us. But now, yes, it seems like it has some weight to it, which is the Lebensraum idea, the idea of collecting all of these German populations in the eastern settling and coming to dominate effectively the heartland. And this is why, again, I believe there is some validity in looking at this point of view, because it's flexible. It's flexible in regards to what power basically considers to be the ultimate threat, whether it be China, whether it be Germany / Europe, or whether it be the Soviet Union / Russia. There are several scenarios one can draw here. One, which you mentioned, Morgov, is the idea of quote unquote Germany going for broke and using the precedent of the Ostsiedlung, the eastern settling, to take over the heartland by this, you can say, call basically to racial, not just to sort of geographic determinism, which is inherent in someone like Haushofer. But then you come to the other idea, which is the terror of Bjorko, the idea of the Kaiser and Nicholas II meeting with their private yachts and deciding that, we are going to tear up the alliances as previously understood, and we are going to reforge an alliance between Germany and the Russian Empire. And under that logic, essentially, again, you have the issue. If Germany doesn't have to deal with the threat of the heartland and all the logistical and manpower capabilities of the heartland, then it is basically free to pursue its naval policy against Great Britain, which is why you could say there was such a determined fear in World War I and in many subsequent conflicts, whether it be pitting Napoleon against the Russians, pitting the Kaiser against the Russians, or pitting Hitler against the Soviet Union. The same logic creeps into all of this. And now, of course, pitting the European Union against Russia, so long as there is this constant unwavering animus between the European powers, however they're constituted, and Russia, the heartland, it basically ensures that America and Britain and the quote-unquote democratic alliance states, in this case he was thinking of France, can achieve a modicum of security. But Semigog, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to throw in that there's another way to look at it. in terms of what is not said, in terms of the stunning silence in the entire theoretical framework. Would you mind going back to the map that just shows the sort of whole picture of the world? Yeah. So when you look at this, the United States, the New World, North and South America are pushed to the periphery of necessity, because in order to show the pivot area most effectively as a pivot, it should take the center of the map. And so you see the way in which the New World is just sort of, relegated to this marginal existence, when in fact, if you look at a British, I call it British, I'm sorry, most of it's English, but when you look at English strategic thinking and the way in which the British islands have been sort of, they've been a fortress protected by a great moat across its history. You can see how there was a projection of the United States to being such a thing. It's thought of as its own sort of unsinkable island fortress. North America itself, with its an even larger moat than Britain had. And of course, you see this with some of the strategic thinking of a figure like Mahan. I mentioned earlier that the way in which we are enjoined to focus on this area is a way in which strategic thinking, coming down now through across more than a century, it's a way in which we've been the nature of the argument and the terms that are presented constrains us to thinking about it in a particular way, when you could easily see the entire landmass of the Americas as its own pivot area. But by keeping us focused on Russia, we maintain English or British interests and strategies, instead of looking at the way in which the New World could be its own kind of pivot area. It's just assumed, it's taken as a given since the end of the Civil War in the United States, in which
the funny thing is, I don't agree with you, and the reason I don't agree with you is because as Mackinder himself developed his theories, he was basically content to place Britain within this complex as nothing more than an American maritime aerodrome. He wrote that in 1943. There is much assumption within British political thinking, essentially, that deference is basically given over to American strategic interests and how Britain can best be served within that whole complex. And the reason I brought up his reference of the Columbian epoch, as I mentioned, he's talking about one thing, which is the creation of a definite geographic world system. But like I said, on the other, it's a threat. It's a threat to the Columbian world system, the idea that we have the geographic pivot towards these certainties. And he believes that in view of his geographic determinism, which is not a view I hold, therefore Russia must be the greatest threat, because even if America can dominate the entirety of the Americas, that being all the way from Canada and Baffin Island all the way down to Patagonia and Argentina, by the whole nature of the Eurasian landmass, there are more people, more resources, and more territory within this area. And so ultimately, yes, you can say that looking at this through the point of view of British interests means that the focus becomes the Eurasian landmass rather than American isolationism. But nevertheless, from his point of view, ultimately, he who controls the Eurasian landmass will ultimately become the world's greatest power. America may exist within that whole nexus as a power, but ultimately, from his point of view, it becomes in America's interests to keep tabs on the pivot area by using Britain, as he says, as this maritime aerodrome, so to speak. So in his view, and in the views of what he considers to be the democratic ideals of enlightened civilization versus the Oriental despotisms, we need to share in this policy. And another thing he mentions, regards to Maham, and juxtaposing this with land power, the viability of land power, he is very much concerned with the vulnerabilities of maritime hegemony. He was directing his arguments against the Germans. He believed that the German U-boat campaign, and the German High Seas Fleet basically invalidated the arguments of Mahan, because no longer were sea routes this source basically of stability and imperial and commercial stability that they were assumed to be, because of the whole fractured nature and, of course, the emergence of competing naval powers and the dominance and stability of the land power, as I mentioned. But he doesn't draw any attention to the fact that American naval dominance ultimately overcomes British naval dominance within World War II. And you can apply basically that same argument. The obsessive focus, like I said, is on Europe, it's on Russia. And like I said, to again push back against this idea of the obsession with British interests, it's against China. And one of the reasons I was so interested in bringing up Mackinder again, as we're looking at this, you can say I would say very amateurish attempt of the American State Department to pivot towards Asia. That seems to be America's own assumption of its own interests lie in protecting Taiwan and in basically trying to break up the Chinese-Russian alliance. Well, Mackinder was prophesizing these sort of things 120 years ago. So like I said, you can look at it as, oh, he's basically, pursuing explicitly English objectives. Yes, they may have been at the time, especially if you look at the huge amount of historical animus he has towards Germany. I mean, I'm thinking about reading out a particular passage, but like I said, ultimately, it is influential and it is relevant because it coincides with not only American theoretical interests, but explicit stated policy.
I would just say that all you've done, as far as I can tell, is make the argument that the New World, the United States, certainly North America, is like a new and better Britain in terms of the rest of the world, as a kind of isomorphic analogy of Britain itself relative to the continent across its history. And so we see a situation where the United States is simply a better place to undertake the British project from, with greater resources and greater access to the seas, and today with a larger fleet performing the same function. And I would also say that you're leaving out the historical warm relations between the U.S., relatively warm, between the U.S. and Russia, that only really began to shift after the victory of the New Englanders, the ones with the strong focus on having come from southern England in the U.S. North. And of course, immediately following that, you had the rise of people like Roosevelt, who was a good friend, as you know, of Mahan's. And you had the appearance of the Great White Fleet, which you know all about, how it was deployed in order to take care of British interests in the Pacific. And as you well know better than I do, that there was a period where there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the United States with a Pacific Fleet should be used in this respect as a policeman, or whether or not all their money should have been placed on the little square for Japan. And of course, the U.S. fleets doing things like getting involved in the Pacific Rim, that was initially supported by the British wholeheartedly. And of course, Roosevelt wrote an article in the Atlantic, extolling the brilliance of Mahan's work, which really to me just seemed like making an argument to the entire United States that they need to fork out the money for a navy in order to take care of what are ostensibly American interests, but in the end ended up serving British interests.
You see, the problem. I don't want to push back too much against this, but I think this is almost in some ways tangential to this discussion. And the reason I say that is because you can say the exact same thing in reverse. So, for example, I bring up Mahan and I bring up Mackinder specifically because he raises this precise point, which is the idea that American domination over the Philippines and American domination over Cuba during the American-Spanish War of 1898 was only made possible because the British basically compelled the Spanish navies to stand down. And again, that's a point I've actually made on other streams, the whole notion that it was contrary to British interests to unequivocally support America's position within the Caribbean and basically inveigling on British maritime interests within the Pacific region. But as you know, Roosevelt was president in 1901, and this was during William McKinley. So this was 7 years before, where the Americans were basically being enabled to have an empire in the Pacific as a result of the direct acquiescence of the British fleet, in particular one instance over the fall of Manila, where the British decisively intervened on the side of the Americans without a shot being fired. And that, again, is an instance of quote-unquote great sea power. So you can say it's English, all English, but like I said, I think it works both ways. And what this is bleeding off, essentially, is Rudyard Kipling and the Great Game, and focusing essentially on all of the areas in which the British Empire becomes vulnerable. You can say that the American Empire either succeeded the British or it became something else or whatever. But the point of view is, yes, there is a degree of continuity within the political calculus. And a lot of Mackinder's thinking is inherited by people like Spikeman. And if you look at this map in particular, which is the successor map, it doesn't talk about the pivot area, instead talks about the rimland. This essentially is the area over which Russia cannot be allowed to gain strategic influence, because as you can tell, it is an area with which Russia can use to project power outwards towards the sea. And in that sense, it is a very quintessential Crimean War argument. You know, we can't allow Russia to have an outlet into the Mediterranean Ocean. Russia can't be allowed to hold on to Constantinople, which is ironic considering that this map actually allocates the Black Sea as part of the heartland, almost assuming that it's guaranteed that if you control the Black Sea, then of course you will be able to operate within this grander strategic political theater of the Indian Ocean, of the Pacific, of the Atlantic, etc. So, you know, we can argue essentially who mainly benefits from this, but it's incontrovertible to say that both American and British thinkers have looked at this and they've taken all of the applications of this, whether it be Prometheism and focusing on containment, anti-communism, or the breakup with Russia specifically because of this, or in trying to detach the major European power, whether it be Napoleon or whether it be Germany, from any alliance with Russia or the Soviet Union for the sake, again, of maintaining Britain's uncontested sea power. And a very tenuous example he comes is going back to this idea of the fall of Crete and the fall of Phoenicia. And you could even say a more contemporary example would actually be the fall of the Netherlands. The idea that Dutch naval power basically became a nonsense when Prussia could easily and without much effort occupy the country within a few days. And this was, you know, going all the way back to the 18th century. All these important things to consider. But Morgoth, you've been very quiet. Anything you would like to say?
Yeah, just on the note on containing communism there over in the Far East, because one of the conflict that we don't talk about very much, and it seems to get forgotten these days, is the Vietnam War. And you can see again that rhetoric of containment was the idea that if Vietnam falls, if all of Vietnam falls, that Asia is going to go down one domino after another. But ultimately, you can see that it's as if they would frame it as if communism was going to take over. But of course, what they really meant, like we're talking about heartland theory again, just this time through an ideological lens. But ultimately, it would have meant that they would have reached, it would have broke out. It would have broke through the Rimland containment zone. And it kind of explains what many people now would regard as being like a totally confusing and pointless conflict with, I think, what was it, 60,000 Americans died or something, like, and the amount of resources that were poured into it, which is people just look at it today as if like totally bizarre. But when you look at this, you begin to think, yeah, it was really about containing. Again, it's always about the containment.
And we see that with Iran today. You know, the policies that have driven Russia into the arms of China to whatever extent, and the policy of tightening the relationships between Russia and China and Iran. You now see a situation where the heartland, at least in terms of trade and logistical corridors, and of course it's divided between, you know, 3 or more countries in terms of some of the stuff with Central Asia, of course, but you've got the heartland here now reaching down through Iran to the Persian Gulf and to the Indian Ocean. And you've got the heartland extended out to all of the Chinese coast now. So you see an interesting situation where, the rimland here has been penetrated in two places, or is on the cusp of being penetrated in that way. The north-south corridor is basically just a cut through through the rimland there down to the Persian Gulf, and that explains, of course, why we've got so much attention on the Emirates to have our own sort of choke point there. Choke points, of course, being central to Mackinder's thinking, but we've also got a way in which the rimland has been cut, as I said, with Russia and China being connected more thoroughly now.
I think this is fascinating because we hear a lot of rhetoric in the news in Britain in particular, maybe even more than what you see in America now with Trump in promising no more wars. But at any rate, London is spreading war propaganda. They're making the wheels are turning to get people prepared for. We're getting bombarded with quite a bit of this. Leaving aside the state of the country and like that's a whole other thing, but like why people probably won't go to fight, that's a whole other subject. But you kind of get the impression that everybody's kind of confused and thinking, well, where are we going to Ukraine? Are we going to Iran? Like what? But I think it's possible that there's people somewhere in London, in some dusty office in Whitehall or whatever, and they are looking at a map like this. And they're like saying what Semyagog's just saying. Like basically, we've now got two breaches in the containment zone, and there's we've got China, which is now and then we've also potentially got Iran breaching as well. And this is, and because of the received wisdom, because it's just ingrained that, well, this means conflict because we can't possibly allow this to happen. And so you begin to see that the wheels turning as if to prepare people for war, prepare people for battle. And again, you get the idea that there's somebody looking at a map like this, looking like saying what Semyagog's just said, like it's the rimland's hemorrhaging, the containment's being broken in 2 or 3 different places.
And the large question is, why did we do that? Because everyone knows, everyone who studied geopolitics and global strategy, the great game, they know that you're not supposed to drive China and Russia together. You're supposed to try to keep them apart. That's the whole thing with Nixon's opening. And we know that Iran was a country that was pretty cut off. It had decent relationships with China, but we were in Afghanistan and it blocked the possibilities there. And Russia was hesitant to get involved with Iran because it hoped for some kind of opening of relations or improvement of relations with the West. And yet we drove all 3 of these elements together. The United States, under the Biden administration and possibly earlier, chose to do this. I think it's absolutely impossible to imagine that they did not know what would occur. So that raises the question for me. I mean, we're simultaneously destroying Europe, and under the Biden administration, we clearly intended. There's just no way to imagine that what has happened, what has resulted, was not foreseen and intended.
You kind of get the impression that the heartland is this sort of amorphous kind of blob where if you push too hard in one direction, the pressure will end up like shoving it off into the other direction. So if you push too hard over the Ukraine issue, you push too hard there, you alienate Russia there, it'll just run towards China. And you get the impression it could go the other way as well. So if you shove too hard in one direction, so if China suddenly turned on Russia, like you would expect the Russians to be very peaceable towards the east, and it is kind of jello where you just push it one direction, it'll bulge out in another.
Can I quickly reference this map, because for people who don't know, this is a you can say, not necessarily historically continuous map over all the territories that were nominally part of the Mongol Empire at one point. So the map on the left, it may look impressive, but ultimately, even by this time, the map had begun to essentially break down, and you have the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty. But nevertheless, when Mackinder is writing about the geographical pivot, he has this in mind. Except for him, the reality which he sees emerging in the 20th century is actually much worse than this. As you can see, the Mongol Empire has an outlet into China, into Korea, into North Vietnam. There's actually a weird episode where, in addition to trying to invade Japan, Kublai Khan actually also tries to invade Java at one point. But that's neither here nor there. But you also see, of course, the control of the Strait of Hormuz through Iran, expanding into Turkey and expanding up to the Danube, modern-day Romania, and in Russia. But for that empire basically to survive, you need to understand the map on the right, which is a very loose understanding basically of where the population centers were within the Mongol Empire at that time. And that essentially is why Mackinder is so terrified, because, as you pointed out, Morgoth, it seems that the Mongol Empire, especially, it had to pivot to one region at the expense of all the others. So the Mongol Empire decided to focus all of its attention under Kublai Khan into controlling China. But that basically meant it lost control over Russia, and it lost control over Iran. Instead, those were held by other dynasties, which overall would fragment, as all of the Mongol states would later fragment. But to speak of basically a heartland in the 13th and 14th centuries, when basically this map, you could say the nightmare of Mackinder, is realized, is rather absurd, because the only thing keeping all of these population centers together is superior Mongol logistics, because there are no great population centers in what Mackinder basically referred to as the pivot area. So when we're coming into the 20th century, when we're talking about this definite understanding of geographical realities, which Mackinder claims, and that sort of informs so much of his geographic determinism, we have this empty space in the middle, which once was connected by the superior logistics of the Mongol armies, is now being filled in by major population centers in southern Siberia and eastern Russia, and those are expanding. And of course, population centers in Central Asia. Interestingly enough, this map at the time isn't so distinct from the relative sort of population balance that we have in Central Asia at this time. But if you essentially have this map, this green map, and it's all filled in, that is basically the understanding of Mackinder's thinking. Instead of the Mongolian horse armies, or the cavalry armies, you now have the Trans-Siberian Railway connecting all of these places. Indeed, it sort of has two natural outlets, which goes back to my Russia's greatest defeat video, where I was talking about the natural extension of Russia to the Carpathian Mountains in the west, but also into the wild fields of Manchuria. And interestingly enough, Mackinder makes this exact same argument, that the natural extension of Russia would be into Manchuria, would be towards Korea, would be towards China. And so therefore it informs so much of British political thinking in terms of propping up their ally Japan in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 to deny Russia access to all of these territories. So this geopolitical reality that you see with the Mongol Empire is basically, as far as Mackinder's being concerned, it is being re-established centuries later. However, unlike what existed at the time of the Mongol Empire, what didn't exist in the 13th and 14th centuries was this Anglophone concern, this idea that the Columbian world and the strategic fortress island of Britain is basically now being placed in a position of existential threat, thanks to the establishment of this empire. And so a theory, the Heartland theory, becomes essentially a necessity in order to understand this and potentially thwart it. And as a result of this, you come back to ideas of containment, etc. So yes, there's also another point, which is, do either of you have anything to say regarding, I'm not sure again how much either of you read Mackinder, but taking the Mongol example, taking the Turkic example, but to add to this, he also looks at the vulnerability of places like Iraq, of Suez, of Egypt, of Syria, vis-a-vis the Arabs. And I was thinking this is basically a forerunner to American policy vis-a-vis Egypt and Arab nationalism, British policy as well, and of course towards Israel today?
No, I don't have anything to say to that.
I do, and it's not from a it's not from the it's not from any perspective of certainty. It's from the perspective of some gaps in Mackinder and Speakman's thinking, and that has to do with the role of Africa. Figures like Mackinder talk about the importance of North Africa, as a position from which trouble could be caused with Suez, and havoc could be wrought, so to speak, in the Mediterranean area and with shipping and trade there. And of course, Suez is a major choke point. You also have the idea of the Dardanelles, a choke point of lesser importance these days, but still an important one. So on the one hand, you look at this entire picture of the heartland as a center of population. Well, the rimland is the center of population, but the heartland is this pivot. But when you look at it from the perspective of a world island, then, and indeed it's presented in that way by Mackinder and others. The main world island is Europe, Asia, and Africa, and it includes a rimland, but it's the rimland of the world island. And of course, most of these projections don't show very well the actual size of Africa. Particularly the Mercator projections that we grew up with in the United States tend to minimize it, just how massive it is. So the Middle East to me is interesting, of course, because it has all the choke points. You call it the Middle East if you're from the old thinking. You call it West Asia if you're, a Mercurius type figure who likes to talk about the global South, and West Asia to signal that it should be connected to China and Russia more than it should be connected to the Western powers. There's all of that. There's all of the importance of energy, and I generally like to think of Israel as a kind of IUD. Back in the days when women would have some strange wiry plastic thing inserted into their uterus, based on the belief that the presence of that foreign object there would prevent the appearance of a fertilized embryo that would grow into a child. I think, as we all know, Israel was placed there in some respect to be an IUD to prevent Arabs from getting their shit together and cooperating. And they have enough trouble doing that even without the presence of Israel. So there's all of that. But I also think of it, and this is a long way of saying it, I also think of it as a way to cut off one half of the world island from the other. And of course, it's a very resource-rich and underdeveloped region, Africa.
Sorry, just for clarity, are you talking about the Suez Canal or Israel?
Well, I'm talking about that whole region of the Middle East, which I understood you to be asking about, and the way in which keeping that area unstable makes it not impossible, but unlikely that you're going to fully develop the logistical corridors and trade through that region, permitting, African resources to flow to the other half of the world island. So I guess what I'm saying there, and not doing a very good job of it, is that in addition to the energy and choke point concerns, I believe that region is of strategic importance because it is a way of dividing the world island into two sections. And when you take a look at someone like Halford, with whom you'll certainly be familiar, you'll know that he had these ideas of north-south combinations, which still strategically inform thinking, it would seem, because the EU has pursued this policy of connection with Africa as a source of resources. So if you cut the heartland off from Africa via instability in the Middle East, then you're in a better position to do a north-south combination, what Haushofer would have called Eurafrica. And we see, all you have to do is visit all these European countries, and you will see the implementation of this Euro-Africa policy. And likewise, I would say that as payback for trouble in Ukraine and Macron's constant posturing about how he's going to send French troops in and the likelihood that they're already there operating sub rosa, Russia went in and just hammered the shit out of France in the last couple of years in terms of creating major problems for them in the Sahel. So hopefully that didn't come out in such a disjointed fashion, and you guys can follow the basic outlines.
Well, no, I mean, in fairness to Mackinder, but he was sort of writing this in 1904 through to 1919, during which Africa was part of the European empires. So we're still thinking basically in an imperial mode before we get to a destabilizing mode, you can say, from the 1940s onwards, when you have the post-imperial period, when you have countries like Syria gaining independence. You have the instability in Iran with the Mossadegh, the coup against Mossadegh in favor of the Shah and things like that. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948. This is all after Mackinder's death, essentially. So the political calculus changes, and indeed you can say that the strategy changes effectively because, as I mentioned, so much of the thinking around what would later become the Great Game and the focus on the pivot area and all this geographical determinism is again based on the idea that Britain and essentially later America via proxies and influence is going to be in control, or the predominating influence within the Rimland and by extension into Africa. Add in decolonization, the whole sort of basis of this changes. But then in fairness to Mackinder looks at the historic potentialities of something like the Arabian Peninsula and believes that a reunification a la Muhammad during the height of the 7th century, which would later lead to the Islamic conquest, etc., could be repeated given his whole view of geographic determinism. Ironically, he puts too much stock on someone like Lawrence of Arabia in terms of being able to achieve that. But again, to your point, Semigog, what actually happens is that the policy of Arab nationalism is screwed over. We have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we have the division of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and what later be the State of Israel. And ultimately, as we see with the failed project of, say, for example, Nasserism or Baathism, which is basically being killed off now that Assad has also been deposed. This policy, which essentially was enacted all the way back in 1916, is very much continuing in this mode. And again, it is in part a response to what Mackinder believes would be the geographically determined outcome of uniting a certain territory in the Arab Peninsula and allowing for it to be dominated, to assume dominance over the Semitic and Levantine territories, but also the extension of that being the heartland theory from the north. He looks at the examples of the Turks and the Abbasid caliphates and later the Seljuks, etc., and the Ottomans coming in and dominating from the north. So from the view of 19th century British thinkers, English thinkers, to be more specific, the view of Arab nationalism from the south and the Soviet Union combined to a ally or satellite in Iran from the north, which again looked as if that could potentially come into existence during the Second World War as well, when the Soviets annexed territories like larger, greater Azerbaijan and looked at one point as if they were going to be turning those into Soviet states.
And a very quick question. 1904, when he's writing, isn't that roughly in the period where Rhodes is talking about Cape Town to Cairo railroads? Do you happen to have a very brief answer for why that all got shut down so thoroughly?
It didn't get shut down so thoroughly. I mean, he talks about this interestingly, as if it would have been the natural outcome that when we speak about Africa, we have to speak of South Africa effectively as an island, due to the impassability of that territory up until, for example, basic inoculations were essentially permitted European travelers to get into Central Africa for the first time, missionaries, etc., in the 19th century. Otherwise, he believes that, again, looking at this point of view of like a geographic determinist, that all it would take is this united Arab power to come through Egypt, go through Sudan, and reach as far as Cape Town, because apart from, like I said, the prevalence of the jungles and the diseases, there would seem to be nothing stopping it. Again, the domination of the heartland through this combination of, or alliance between the Arab states and Russia. As for the whole sort of unity of Cecil Rhodes's project, I mean, like I said, we're talking about like an imperial paradigm in 1904. 1904 is just after the Second Boer War, and it'll be 6 years when we have the consolidation of South Africa into the Union of South Africa. So that project, the Milner Kindergarten, etc., of uniting all these territories, of creating, a Belgian possession over Rwanda and Burundi, and later a League of Nations mandate in Tanzania. After World War II, these territories were actually connected, but like I said, they could come against the American view, which is that of decolonization, and of course the destructive effects of our involvement in both World War Wars that lead us effectively bankrupt. And so decolonization becomes essentially the route following the Winds of Change speech in 1960. Like I said, when we talk about Mackinder, he has odes to various things, but he's also speaking within somewhat of the mindset of, like I said, a contemporary of Cecil Rhodes.
Roger that. Sorry to interrupt you, Morgoth.
I was just going to point. I remember you did a stream a while ago about the impossibility of peace in Ukraine, and then when I look at Iran on the map here and its situation at the south of the Caspian Sea, and you can just look to the north and you can see that you run into Russia immediately. And then recently we've had the talk about, as soon as the Israel and Iran went on the 12-day war, as Trump called it, there was talk about regime change. There was talk about installing a Shah. And I was thinking, if Iran gets knocked out here, if there's an overthrow, and if they actually do this, are then Russia and China going to tolerate having what would amount to an American client state in that position just south of the Caspian Sea? Or would we not just be doing the Ukraine thing all over again, where nobody's happy and everybody sees it as an existential threat? Because you can imagine, like you can just look at it just in terms of geography, not even to mention the supply lines and all of the gas pipes and the energy reserves and all of the rest of it. To actually, if you succeeded in having Iran as a client state, like what does that mean for Russia under Putin, but then more largely in terms of the rimland and containment? Because it seems to me they just couldn't allow that to happen, that you would be faced with another Ukraine situation.
There are two things to address. I'm going to sort of bring up Ukraine later on because it's a very important point. But the main thing that separates Ukraine from Iran is that Ukrainian nationality is a modern thing. It doesn't really come into existence until the late 19th century. As much as people want to claim that, Ukraine is the original Russia, and you go back to the Kievan Rus and, Vladimir the Great, etc., as an intellectual movement and a proposition, it comes to the fore within the Austrian Empire, and then it becomes a statelet in the 1920s, effectively. Whereas Iran is a civilization state that's existed for over 2,000 years. So what Ukraine is basically having to grapple with is a crisis of identity, because it's never basically had to form one in such absolute opposition, say, for example, to Russia, given the fact that there are so many Russian speakers and the whole territory of Ukraine isn't conducive for a distinct anti-Russian national identity, which is what I was trying to get across. But so that, I believe, is fundamental in terms of understanding the distinction between Iran and Ukraine, even though both are heterogeneous states effectively. Iran doesn't have a long history as being part of the Russian Empire. But onto the question of Iran, that is basically the situation that existed pre-1979. I mean, the Shah, following 1953 up until 1979, Americans and British had extraterritoriality. BP was effectively a foreign-owned concern. So much of the focus of the revolution, again, was this notion, essentially, of the assertion of Iranian sovereignty vis-a-vis America. And you can almost say that that is actually not continuous with the historical norm. I mean, so much of the historical norm of the last 150 years, Morgoth, has actually been of a implicit power sharing agreement between the British, later the Americans, and the Russians. Basically, the Russians have a controlling influence over the northern part of Iran, the Mazandaran, the areas of the South Caspian, and over the Azeri-dominated populations around the city of Tabriz. And the British and the Americans have control over the areas around nearing Baluchistan, i.e. the borders of the Indian Empire, now Pakistan, and of course the Khuzestan region, the Zagros Mountains, the area where there is the preponderance of Iranian oil, for example. What happened is in the 1940s and 50s, the Soviet Union overextended itself on many different fronts. We already know about the Berlin blockade. We know about the Iron Curtain. We know about the formalization of the Warsaw Pact. What we know less of is the fact that Turkey, for example, had historically positive relations with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union pressed too far and Turkey ended up becoming a part of NATO. In the same way in Iran, Stalin tried to annex large regions of northern Iran to the Soviet Union in the Azeri-dominated populations, what we see to be key zones of Russian interests. And all that did was drive the Iranians further into the arms of the British and Americans. So that situation, like I said, it basically existed between 1953 and 1979. As for the potential of that happening again, I've seen the thing brought up that if this happens, it'll be an existential issue for China. It'll be an existential issue for Russia, not just from the point of view of an outlet into the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean, but from the point of view of China and Russia being, reliant on Iranian resources, etc. I don't see that happening. Personally, I believe that what the effect of the 12 days quote unquote war has basically been has to consolidate the Iranian regime, not the opposite. And I also think that Russia has more interest basically in being invested in Iran as a vassal. So it doesn't do something, say, for example, as acquiring nukes from North Korea and going rogue. So it's a very interesting question, like I said, but those are just some thoughts on the history and the policy regarding that region. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
So I think moving on to like the final area for this evening is something that Semigod brought up quite early on, which is this idea of Prometheism. We've had this idea of the Heartland not being able to break into the Rimland effectively, or the ulterior crescent, something which Mackinder would refer to. But now we have the idea of breaking up the Heartland itself, because so much of the anxiety, the strategic thinking, is predicated in the idea that the Heartland is basically engorged or formed an alliance with states surrounding it, the main states being China, Iran, or the European Union, assumed at the time to be under the domination of the Germans. And of course, that was the strategic thinking up until the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. But he draws reference specifically to tyrannism. And interestingly, Mackinder is not an advocate for the breakup of the Russian Empire. In fact, if you read him, he is actually quite the Slavophile. He goes as far as basically to say that the cause of World War One was that of a Slav rebellion against the encroachments of the German-dominated Austro-Hungarian and Prussian alliance, effectively, which is historically ridiculous. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting to see that so much of the thinking of the time of Britain, of a certain sort of Prussophobic, Germanophobic theorists, which will later go on basically to inform someone like Winston Churchill, is the fact that the ethnic makeup of Russia is an incidental feature. And this is where you can basically say that if there is some credence given to this idea of the notion of a heartland beyond the geographic certainties, is the idea that, at least to someone like Mackinder, and he's very much basing this off the ideas of a Finnish ethnologist, Matthias Castrén, that there are quote unquote Turkic speaking language groups as far as northern Siberia, all the way up until we get to northern Iran, the Azeris, and modern Turkmenistan. And that would effectively enable for an assertion of a heartland, quote unquote, formed by this geography due to the, you can say, continuities between these various language groups. What he doesn't do is something that you and I, Semyagog, have talked about extensively, is try and take these language groups and use it as the justification for nation building, something in opposition to a Slav-dominated heartland, which in this case would be the Russian Empire. He doesn't really deal with the Slav question at all. Like I said, he seems to be viewing the opposite. His attempt is essentially to de-Germanize the Slav-speaking areas of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire to make it less German and effectively more Slav. You can say in many ways he's an advocate for pan-Slavism, which would actually later run contrary to British interests, such as the fixation of Germany. But nevertheless, when we get to a figure like Pilsudski, as you mentioned, Semyagog, we have this idea of taking the heartland and pitting all these various nationalities against each other. Because, of course, on the one hand, we have Poland in the west, but we have Japan in the east. We've already mentioned the Russo-Japanese War. But again, it's this idea that both these powers on the extremes of both sides of the quote-unquote heartland can use nationalism as a means to break up the Slav preponderance of the Russian Federation. And Ukraine is a banner example of this. And the reason why I believe, if the Ukraine project works, why there's such an obsession behind the Ukraine project working is, with the possible exception of Belarus, Ukraine is the most Russified of all of the former Soviet republics. It doesn't have a distinct history of independence like the Baltic states, which were more aligned to Sweden, Denmark, and of course, the Baltic German nobility, nor indeed when we talk about like the Bukhara Emirates and the princely Muslim states in Central Asia, all the more sort of Chinese influenced areas in the East. Instead, if Ukraine is basically able to form an identity which is detached from Russia, then all of a sudden you can take the Tartars of Kazan, you can take the Kalmucks, and you can take the areas around the Kuban region. Even, there aren't many Circassians left, of course, Semyagog, but you can take all of these myriad ethnic groups, the Finno-Ugric populations around the Ural Mountains, and you can pit them against this conception of Russian unity. This isn't something, like I said, which is implicit to Mackinder, because this isn't Mackinder's focus of concern. But when we look beyond the policies of containment and we look further towards the dismantling of the heartland itself, consolidating the Rimland effectively with organizations like NATO, like Iran formerly being an ally in 1979, NATO being a current member, Ukraine potentially joining NATO, Finland now being a member of NATO, Japan being an ally with the United States, and then you focus on the dismantling of the heartland itself. Basically, what do you... I just want to basically ask your thoughts on this.
Well, it ties in with what Morgoth was asking about earlier with the importance of Iran in various respects. Of course, Turkey, as a NATO power, has been heavily involved in pushing a kind of pan-Turanism. I mean, back in the old days of, Enver Bey, who wanted to disappear up into, I can't even remember, maybe he did disappear up into Central Asia trying to push pan-Turanism. He was
yes,
on the bottom.
Yes, he was shot.
Yeah,
he formed an alliance with the Emir of Bukhara and tried to launch a rebellion in Central Asia, but he was just killed off by the Red Army.
Yeah, they said, fuck that shit. Pardon my French. But so Turkey has long been involved, arguably, more recently with Western support in trying to get things going in that region. The Chinese, by contrast with their own problems with the Uyghur, have been trying to tamp that down. It's also not in Russia's interest. So you've got Russia saying, no, thank you. And you have China saying, no, thank you. And then you have Turkey as a NATO power trying to get up in there and involved with things. There was a guy I knew who went from Xinjiang, China, all the way to Turkey on the old Silk Road with camels. Back in that brief period in the in the second half of the 90s when such things were possible. And he visited some places that were basically cultural centers, NGO kind of organizations in Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, where, what's his name? Oh, good God, what's his name? Gülen, Fethullah Gülen, and his people were heavily funding outreach of this kind. So there's been a push to get involved up in that area. But to bring it back around to what I said at the outset here, that this ties into Iran. Iran, as you very well know, AM, has long-standing relationships along the Silk Road routes and up through Central Asia. You know, in ancient times, you had the Sogdians speaking an Iranic language on the borders and within what is now Chinese territory. So if you have Iran, you have a tool to counterbalance pan-Turkism in the so-called stands of the heartland. So that by way of a brief sort of set of remarks on the influence of Turkey and pan-Turkist ideas in that region, the importance of China in particular and Russia as well, being disinclined to let that go too far, and they wield considerable influences in places like Kazakhstan, which you're familiar with, which is probably one of the most important, or one of the most important ones in terms of its energy and its size. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that Iran is a gateway to that region. Both of you will probably remember that in the days of the Great Game, the classic Great Game of the 19th century, a lot of the British spies and agents and surveyors and the rest, they went into that region via Iran and supported by Iranian intelligence assets.
One of the things with Mackinder is that he views it that there's an ingrained sort of liberalism and progressivism to the sea-based powers. And there's at the same time, the heartland, the land-based powers are inherently more conservative and rooted to the land. And what I think is interesting when we bring in the idea of breaking up the heartland itself into all of the various different ethnicities and little statelets and everything, is when you look at Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory, whatever it's called. And he's basically, because it's interesting because he is kind of like an intellectual of the heartland and he despises Western liberalism. And I'm pretty sure that he'll have read Mackinder and imbibed all of that, but from like a totally different perspective. But in the fourth political theory, what isn't it called? He wants to have this. It's a kind of convoluted, I think, but basically he wants to ensure that all of the different ethnicities in Russia, or in the heartland in this case, have their place. They feel secure. That they're not going to have, say, their demographics changed by immigration. They're not going to be moved around. They're not going to have their traditions undermined. They're not going to get the kind of drubbing that liberalism dishes out to Western nations. And in a sense, he frames that as being a sort of a counter to Western liberalism. But again, when you come back to Mackinder and you come back to Heartland theory, you can see that there's actually quite a pragmatic angle to that. I think he even wants to have some kind of Islamic Orthodox fusion religion, which everybody can be happy with in the region. And the thing is, the pragmatic side of it is, of course, to form a kind of glue to where they do actually have a common family. They are all interconnected by being within the heartland, and within that they've all got their place. They've all got their sense of being. They're all spiritually at peace. And all of this kind of thing, they're not going to be disturbed. They're going to be protected from the changes and the endless, let's go back to what I was saying about the water flowing. They're not going to have that. They're going to remain rooted, and they're going to be watched over, it's going to be illiberal, fundamentally an illiberal way of looking at it. And on the one hand, you can think, yeah, this is a kind of sort of theory cell kind of intellectualism. It's got Heidegger baked in there and everything. But at the same time, it's also just pragmatism when you look at the threats and you look at the idea of Prometheism, as you call it, where we will break it all apart. It kind of ticks both of those boxes on sort of consolidating the heartland, but without actually sort of forcing everybody to have one ideology, as say what happened with communism or whatever. But it does seem a bit convoluted and complicated.
Well, just to add credence to everything you said, because it's very interesting. Dugan, I believe, because we already brought up Spengler, introduced by the idea of Russia's cultural pseudomorphosis, the idea that Russia is basically in a state of, at least during the 19th century, in a state of arrested civilization, that Russia's civilization hadn't emerged of whatever it was supposed to be. Then we talk about Dugan, talk about the fourth theory, and he brings up Heidegger, and I believe he misapplies the concept of Dasein, which is beingness, which is, at its most simple level, it's being which is self-aware. But of course, within that whole notion, you then apply it to Russia, and it becomes basically Heideggerian apologetics for what Putin refers to as Russia as, which is a civilization state, which is, okay, well, I'm not going to be enamored of this overly theoretical approach by someone like Dugan. I'm instead going to apply to history, effectively, as the common thing that binds us all together. And thank you for your words regarding my my Ukraine video, because the reason I brought that up and the reason why I focused on the futility of peace in Ukraine is because I don't believe you can create a top-down theoretical straitjacket for Russia to fit into. You mentioned the example of a fusion of the Orthodox and Islamic parties within Russia. Mentioned the idea of being that self-aware. Well, of course, self-aware to the point of view that it just understands that it's nothing more than a deconstruction of national identity. And then you take this further and apply it to someone like Ukraine. Ukraine has more reason than most places in Russia, like I said, to have historical connection to Muscovy. And so it's been a great success, you can say, of modern Ukrainian nation building and identitarianism, sectarianism, to find a way, a contrived means of separating Moscow from true Russian civilization and making them separate from one another. So you can say it's a supreme and naive form of idealism to believe that groups which are far more ethnically and religiously distinct, like, say, for example, the Tatars of Kazan, can be appropriated into Russian civilization, which has been made a nonsense of when you compare it to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia today. But you're correct in basically the assumption that it is a means of keeping the heartland together, which is, I'm going to flip this argument on its head again and say that I have a very unpopular view among a lot of people who are sympathetic towards the Tsar of Russia. It's part of the reason why, even though I'm enamored and love Russian history, my views are more rooted in a concern for the truth, and I have no time for apologetics of any form. And so I believe, I'm one of the very few people who believes that along with Sean McMeekin, a very capable historian who I've referenced in this channel before, that Russia has most of the blame involved in the original creation of the conflagration of World War One over the Serbian crisis. And it's interesting again that Mackinder talks about this war as a liberation of the Slav peoples against the German populations. And I believe that's significant because I actually believe it betrays something which is far more insidious. I'm going to bring this back to this idea of perfidious Albion semigog. The idea that the Tsar pursued I would say, an overtly pan-Slavic ideology a aggressive expansionist pan-Slavic nationalism compared to what something, say, for example, like Dugin would advocate, which would be familiarity and civilizational cooperation with non-ethnic sort of Slavic groups and Christian groups. But instead, this was the nationalism that entailed the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the annexation of the Polish regions of Prussia. If we're going to take that, then doesn't it seem that pan-Slavism is just a tool by which we can see the Heartland theory being enacted against the interests of Germany and Russia, to pit these two civilizations against each other, to de-Germanize the Russian Empire, meaning to create the friction between the Slavic and the German populations, something that was again done over when we talk about World War II, except pitted from the other side. Now it's the Germans wanting to expand up to the Volga. It's the Germans looking for Lebensraum. In other words, these ideologies of supranationalism, you can say, are actually informing part of British political thinking, because it keeps these nations pitted against each other. Beyond, you can say, another ideological lens that you can apply to World War II, but not World War I, which is the idea of National Socialism versus communism at the same time. We have to create not just ethnic juxtapositions between the heartland and the various regions that we would be concerned of allying with them, but we also have to create ideological, ethnic, existential struggles between them. I just find that quite fascinating to consider.
I would add, I mean, that's very well said. And of course, Mackinder is explicit about it, that, you know, Germany is an issue. Russia is an issue. But when we today think about the Heartland theory, there's so much focus on Russia that we forget that Germany is, you know, one of the key players in this whole, I guess, on this whole geostrategic game board. And that this fact, which you underscore here, goes a long way to explaining how and why perhaps the whole Ukraine project seems to be aimed just as much at destroying Germany utterly as it does seem to be aimed at creating problems for Russia as well.
I mean, it's basically taking the old nationalism argument and turning it on its head and seeing that, of course, as we see with Ukraine, and as we saw with the Tsar wanting, say, for example, to take over Czechoslovakia and become Tsar of Bohemia, etc., the same example has been used again and again, whether it be the Germans against the Slavs or the vice versa, or even better, from the point of view of the degradation of the heartland, causing inter-Slavic strife within the whole makeup of pan-Slavism, which is why, again, Putin has to desperately appeal to a fading notion of historical continuity. You know, you can look at this and say, you know, that's very, very cynical. But you have to sort of look at how committed someone like Mackinder is. So, for example, he laments over and over and over again how Britain didn't get involved in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Of course, most people look to that and say, you know, thank goodness we didn't get involved in that conflict. But the fact that someone like Mackinder is basically advocating the wisdom in hindsight of basically something that would have been impossible and near suicidal at the time, and would have left us in a terrible position and would have been completely ruinous to France more so than happened historically. I think it's interesting the extent to which he'll go in order to counter what he believes to be Prussian despotism. Just something to consider. Morgoth, any thoughts?
I think it's interesting that when we look at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, to point out, like, Mackinder would have thought that the Prussians were more barbaric, they were more of the land, and the Germans on the west would have been more liberal. But then I think, it may have been him, or was it all of the Germans? But I just think it's interesting that the Iron Curtain, ran straight through the middle of it and kind of disconnected it. So we got the liberals, and then the sort of the problematic Prussians were kept in the east.
Well, I mean, you know, the Bavarians are very parochial and, you know, socially conservative and Catholic. When you look at Germany and you look at you can say the centers of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, you look to places like the Nord Rhine, the Ruhr, Bremen, Hamburg, areas which were formerly republics within the Holy Roman Empire and then the Kaiserreich. So yes, there is that element, but of course you have to remember that places like Berlin and various industrial areas in the east were also quite left wing. But I mean that's basically another question of the liberal makeup of West Germany versus East Germany. But again, another interesting point to consider: why is it that a German alliance with the Soviet Union or a German alliance, the Kaiserreich allying with the Tsar, is such a horrific prospect that a world war must be contrived to prevent that happening? And yet at the same time, many policymakers in the 1940s, before you can say really the emergence of containment, were prepared to basically allow for the Soviet Union to occupy half of Europe.
Yes, we haven't even touched on the fact that at its greatest extent, what would be considered the Rimland was essentially West Germany at its further, and that was as a yeah.
I think again that the point I made, I mean, when I was talking about the Russo-Japanese War, and I was talking about the victories of Stalin and the consolidation of Stalinism, Marxism, Leninism, and the Soviet Union, and of course we're also talking about the idea of the communists in China as well, and the fact that they were allied to one another before the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. What is interesting, though, about that situation is that regardless of how vast the quote-unquote control of the heartland emanating out to these regions, the very basis of the Rimland was still controlled by the powers basically following the Mackinder view of things, i.e., India did not become communist, contrary to some expectations. Pakistan was a Western ally. Iran, for most of its history, was a Western ally. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Turkey were Western allies. Of course, Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway. If the Soviet Union had control, say, for example, over Denmark and Norway, it could have had effective access into the Atlantic. Instead, it had to settle with the Arctic seaport of Murmansk. In the east, of course, when you had the Sino-Soviet split, all of the potential aspirations you had of expanding, towards South Korea, as we saw with the Korean War, towards Japan, towards Taiwan, were again thwarted. And of course, you mentioned the example with Vietnam. So regardless of how great, ostensibly, the victory of Stalin would appear, they were ultimately still hemmed in within this Rimland because they were unable, the Soviets, to project effective power out towards the sea in a way that would have been, I would say, strategically decisive. So this can go back to thinking which is much, much earlier than Mackinder, going all the way back to Lord Palmerston and getting involved in Greece, getting involved in the Turkish Empire, all to prop up states that would deny Russia and the quote-unquote heartland power access to all of these crucial maritime spheres. And of course, if we see the main gaping hole in that is not actually East Germany or Eastern Europe, it's actually China. That, of course, ironically, was not sold by the West, but as a result, you can say, of the own personal ambitions and the own brand of communism espoused by Mao Zedong.
I mean, what I'm interested in as well, because I get called both a kind of Western sort of warmonger, NATO shill, and a Russian shill. On a given day, I get called both of those. And what I think is interesting is that there's assumption in the general discourse that mainly because of certain big sort of podcasts on YouTube, which are sort of adjacent to our circles, that the Russia, then the heartland, has actually no interest in breaking out. It has no interest in moving further in any direction. All it wants is kind of happy trade negotiations and helping countries with their economies and being friendly to everybody. And is it fair to say that as Putin, Russia, as it's constituted now, actually does want or is happy to just sit there and not actually expand further out? Because it really matters when we sort of look at some, say, the Duran. And I did an article a while ago about this, which a lot of people kind of seem to be shocked by, because I was essentially saying the European Union actually should rearm itself. I find it weird and ridiculous that, like, it has become sort of received wisdom that the European Union would just have no weapons, that it would be essentially demilitarized entirely. And this, at the same time, that the Americans were moaning that they weren't paying enough for NATO and all of the rest of it. And it seems to be that this idea that we are always the aggressor, we are always the one that's provoking the problem. And in the case, there's a lot of attention paid to Britain here, but in the modern context, in the context in the 2020s, it really is bureaucrats in the European Union who are banging the drums just as loud as anybody in London, which I find bizarre, to be quite honest. Again, like they aren't sort of inherent sea powers. Belgium or Austria or these, they're not actual sea powers. The European Union is sort of on a big peninsula. I can at least understand that it's the received wisdom in the British Isles, in London. But even then, we have to kind of think, well, we just remain utterly defenseless because at the end of the day, the heartland just wants peace and love. And I just think, is this historically normal to think this way, or is it that I was listening to a podcast, like a YouTube video essay on this the other day, and he was pointing out actually that sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But the point of it was that it's all, the aggression is all one way, and that there's no incentive and no interest in Russia actually expanding in any place. And I just think that's a big risk. What if you're wrong?
What if I'm wrong?
No, like the sort of the general consensus that we don't need to be armed because Russia has no interest whatsoever in breaking
Yes,
free.
I think unfortunately you need to be cynical of anyone who peddles that particular line. But just before I get to your question, yes, read some history. And yes, but the Baltic Sea is like the Black Sea. It's hemmed in by other powers that control the gateway, in this case, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, which Russia was never able to finally defeat. And of course, as you know, Peter the Great was basically an advocate of Alfred Teja Mahan's ideas 200 years before they became sort of endemically in vogue. Regarding your point about what the European Union is doing, whatever the European Union is doing is playing right into the hands of the Mackinder theorists, basically, which is the idea that Europe must be kept permanently separated from the heartland, lest it pose a threat to Britain or America, or the quote unquote democratic powers, as someone like Mackinder would refer to them as. You take someone like Angela Merkel and the overriding concern that she was becoming too dependent on Nord Stream, on Russian gas pipes. And on the other hand, we now know that she was pursuing a double game of essentially allowing for economic cooperation, but also helping along the Maidan movement and the separation of Ukraine from Russia as well. But now you come to the modern position of someone like a Friedrich Merz, who has none of the capabilities of such nuance, or dare I say, elements of duplicity in that argument, that just seems to be passionately against Russia for no reason. So that's one extreme. And the other extreme, of course, is saying that, we have nothing to fear from Russia. In fact, I'm afraid to say that I've heard the argument that Russia has never been a threat to Europe, which I can just discount as being historically preposterous. You just need to look at the ambitions of Alexander I, You need to look at the whole basis of the communist project. Yes, you may try and separate Russia as a nation as distinct from the Soviet project, but the Soviet project was quite clear in terms of what it wanted to achieve, whether aggressively or by other means, i.e., asymmetrical warfare, or what have you. And I've already mentioned my rather revisionist take of the bellicose nature of Tsar Nicholas II. How he basically precipitated two major wars, both of which Russia lost catastrophically. But in both instances, I believe they were fundamentally aggressive. So yes, on the one hand, it makes sense effectively for, you can say, Europe to not assume a position of benevolence from the heartland, which is incredibly naive. Yet we've also assumed the opposite position, which is that modern day Russia is basically National Socialist Germany again. And something that I find fascinating about Putin, and actually compared to, say, for example, the arguments of pan-Slavism that you bring up, that have been brought up and brought up by a lot of other people, is the idea that now Putin seems to be belatedly pursuing a Milosevic-esque foreign policy. Whereas Milosevic's policy was a first resort. In the case of Putin, it seems to be a last resort. It's taken him only somewhat, 25 years to finally pursue a policy of the repatriation of quote-unquote Russian-speaking territories in Ukraine, as part of Russia proper. And of course, the logic is that the more hostile and opposed Europe becomes to Russia, the more aggressive Russia becomes, which in turn makes the possibility of peace in Ukraine impossible, because it will basically require that Zelensky cannot survive while Putin does. One can't live while the other survives, thereby guaranteeing constant warfare and the futility of peace in Ukraine. And once you have that, you have basically achieved what British theorists have wanted to achieve in World War One by getting the Tsar and the Kaiser to fight, or what Roosevelt and what Winston Churchill wanted in World War Two, which was getting Hitler and Stalin to fight. You're basically taking the European powers and you're pitting them against the heartland and ensuring that basically they're directed against each other and not directed against the forces from without. And that's why I believe Mackinder, at least from, you can say, in vagaries, in sort of grand strategic thinking, you can take someone like Mackinder and see the continuities and the implications of this mode of thinking being employed again and again and again and again over the course of the last 120 years.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in the sort of because I do think there is a form of asymmetric warfare going on in information war, which is why I think we have to be careful and question what it is we're listening to on YouTube and social media, and what sort of becomes received wisdom in somebody like Tucker Carlson, for example. And you think, are they really as innocent as what he paints out? And ultimately, I think it leaves you in a strange position, because the position that you're expected to adopt is one of complete sort of impotence and neutrality. And I'm always suspicious when that's pitched to me in any context. And I just find it very interesting times.
Well, it's very interesting you bring up that phrase, impotent neutrality, because of course I believe neutrality is not impotent, but when you add that prefix, it actually sums up so much of Russian political thinking and indeed Stalin's political thinking. During the aftermath of World War II, Stalin wanted Germany to be impotently neutral. Basically, we're talking about the Morgenthau plan on steroids: complete deindustrialization, depopulation, and being treated essentially as a European no man's land. You can almost say that what Russia is achieving de facto is a Morgenthau plan, which is basically being able to inflict by the disastrous policy of its enemies, you can say, i.e. the deindustrialization of, and by extension, the impotence of Europe. But that is a continual threat. I mean, it's even the case with Austria today. what Austrian reunification in the 1950s and 1955 was predicated on was this idea that Austria will be neutral and Austria shall never be allowed to join NATO. And while Finland and Sweden have gone away from that, Austria has remained so in that case. That again is a legacy of this Soviet/Russian idea of their interpretation, their version of neutrality, so to speak. And again, you can say that as one version of the Heartland theory. Does the Heartland theory essentially want to establish want to thwart alliances between these two states? Or would it be essentially content to have one be politically neutered or the other? I think the Heartland theory actually doesn't allow for that. It doesn't really make any contentions for peace. And something which I also believe has in some cases invalidated Mackinder is that Mackinder is a realist. Mackinder doesn't pay heed to the notions of international law, or really you can say the efficacy of things like permanent systems of peace, even though he was writing at a time at the nascence of the League of Nations, which of course we all know was a disaster in hindsight. But what is assumed in Mackinder is a system in constant conflict, and you can see that being played out in Ukraine. But what Putin seems to be going for, ironically, is a system of international law. He wants to appeal to the rights of countries like Iran. You can say, oh, look, the attack on Iran recently on Fordow, etc. It was a violation of international law. And so China and Russia must uphold the rights of the smaller states and international law, nuclear non-proliferation, etc., etc. While the Mackinder thesis basically enforces this idea, like traditional realists, realpolitikers, of the Hobbesian state of nature. There is constant conflict, and it's simply a matter of ensuring that the Heartland does not establish a hegemony over the world island in order to threaten the British Isles effectively. That by a roundabout way of, again, trying to answer some of your questions.
Yes, and I mean, I've noticed this sort of obsession of not just Russia, but also China and various countries around there with the United Nations, to almost autistically sort of deferring to the authority and the legitimacy of the United Nations. And what I think that does is to say that, yes, ultimately, we will take ownership of law and authority. We will become actually the Leviathan, and it's the Western nations, it's the Atlanticists, it's the collective Wests and Israel who are the barbarians, who are outside of international law. The international norm becomes the sort of what the heartland wants is the long play being ruled out here. And I actually think the West fall into that quite a bit. Even the sort of the total disregard that Netanyahu has, where you have then the global South looking at what's happening in Gaza and being kind of tacitly sort of nodded along and encouraged by countries like Russia or China to say, yes, this is just totally beyond the bounds. We can't allow this to happen. This is wrong. And so what you see is that the heartland then, in the case of this discussion, it's kind of elbows aside the original sort of classic liberal ideals which created it, which were of the West, and instead puts their own sort of, they sort of subsume it, they take it over, and they say, yeah, we are actually international law, and it is the West that is crazy. And you also see that the Duginism of everybody, all these different little ethnic enclaves and all these different tribes and all these different, yes, you will all be protected and we're going to make sure you're all protected. It's the liberal West, which is insane, which is imperialistic, which doesn't care about international law. We are the foundation. We are the solid granite rock of international relations. And it is Washington, London, and the European Union who are these maniacs outside of normality and the bounds of normal, which is, of course, completely inverts the sort of end of history. We will all become liberals around the world sooner or later. It pushes them on the outside. It pushes that, like, quite literally, institutionally, it pushes them out onto the rimland. It pushes them back out into the periphery of the sea lanes and away from the heart, the literal heartland.
And just to buttress your point, I think the reason for this is not just an inversion of liberal values, but I think, again, this comes back to the question of geography, which is ultimately what Mackinder specializes in. The idea that Russia can afford, essentially, to take more blows. It can afford to take a more legalistic interpretation of things because it has strategic depth, it has manpower, and it has resources in a way that the Western countries, with the exception ultimately of America, but not to the same extent as Russia, do not have. And this is basically played out in the idea in both both wars, that Germany attacks Russia first. In both cases, Germany seems to be operating from the assumption that we need to assert tactical superiority in the short term against Russia, because in the long term, the more we basically allow for Russia to consolidate its position, we will be in a weaker position vis-a-vis Russia because of these inbuilt advantages which, in Mackinder-esque fashion, the heartland affords, and thereby it compels us towards necessity knows no laws, and we must effectively engage in desperate actions, whether it be, for example, the thinking of Moltke and the Two-Front War, or indeed the thinking of Hitler, just knock in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down effectively. So yeah, in the same way, you can say that Western thinkers were looking at using tactical nukes to offset the manpower disadvantages that the NATO armies had versus the Red Army. It's built around this association that Russia and China now can afford to play for time in the way that the West can't, and thereby the West will be forced into making or asserting positions which seem contrary to things like international law, and thereby, ironically, heartland, the Russia, becomes the guarantee of such systems of international law.
Yes, you see as well with Iran, who became like the Ayatollah became a meme because nothing ever happens. He just does literally nothing. They just get abuse after abuse after abuse, and yeah, they will do a kind of performative retaliation, which strikes an airfield here or there, but actually not much. And then when you get the quote unquote 12 days war, what I found interesting was that after Israel struck Iran, they tweeted out, just remember, we did not initiate this. And then they actually hit back pretty hard, to the point that my view on that is that Israel went running to America, begging them to sort some sort of ceasefire out. And so you see again this idea that, well, we are not the ones breaking international law. In fact, we're going to bend over backwards not to be perceived as being the aggressors, and we are going to do everything that we can. And you get into this kind of sort of bureaucratic horse trading where they're not the International Atomic Agency. Now they can legitimately say, well, we were taken for a ride. We were ripped off. We did everything that you wanted. We were in negotiations. And you see, actually, it does actually flesh out their case. It does actually work in a kind of long drawn out way. And again, it's the West who are transgressing these laws which they set up themselves.
Yes, and you're exactly right to use the example of Israel vis-a-vis Iran as a comparison. We talk about Semigog's idea about the necessity of using the Middle East as a means basically to destabilize the whole notion of the world island. And then we take about the idea of forcing Germany to fight off against the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire. The logic is always the same. And speaking of Semigog, you've been very patient. Anything you would like to say?
Well, one thing to the earlier point about Germany and Russia fighting, and this notion that that somehow Russia is this placid, peaceful creature, and it doesn't have expansionist desires. That is, of course, preposterous, basically for the simple reason that it's threatened by a too powerful Germany on its western flank, and so that has to be resolved. Now, a lot of that has been shifted over to the dynamic of Russia and China as two massive and powerful states in Eurasia. But historically, there was every reason for Russia to undertake aggressive efforts in order to basically to subsume Germany in one fashion or another, or impose a kind of atrophy upon it. And in part, that's because of the way in which Germany has been used by the West, or goaded or provoked by the West. But it's not as though they don't have their own agency, or did not historically. And then there's the other idea of, how one conceives of war. The more I read about history and politics and strategy, the more I am very much of the opinion that everything is a state of war. It's not a matter of talking about fifth generation warfare or asymmetric warfare. It's just everything is war. It just happens to have a threshold that can be reached where it becomes kinetic. And when you look at it from that perspective, Russia has been very aggressively moving to do things with Europe in terms of energy. It was only when I looked into the immediate period after World War II that I became aware of all the U.S. investment, in the Atoms for Peace and Euratom programs, basically to set up nuclear power across Europe as a counterbalance. Because otherwise, Europe, with the small exceptions like North Sea oil, Europe is basically what my friend Tim used to describe as a vermiform appendix, just dangling off of Russia in terms of its natural resources. There's just so little there. And so from the 1960s, there were plans that the Germans undertook with the Russians to bring pipelines into Europe. And in the 70s, that started to take shape. And so Russia has been moving to basically run its energy supplies into Europe, and thereby, as many people have discussed, make Europe dependent upon them. Now they're going to have to look at the option of, such as it is, of receiving their energy from elsewhere. So that's something to think about. There are different dimensions of aggression, and because if one takes this expanded definition of warfare, then everything, economics, trade, logistical corridors, all of this is a form of war. So yeah, that. One other thing that I wanted to add was that the Arctic did not come into this discussion, and we needn't go deeply into it, but it is worth noting that with the ice cover there, it's not exactly the sea. And because of how resource rich it is, enormous amounts of energy resources, also mineral resources, and the importance of it as a trade corridor in future with the nuclear powered icebreakers and the rest, the partnership of Russia and China, with China dubbing itself a near Arctic power, and previous activities to get a piece of Greenland that China was involved in. We have to think of the Arctic or I think it's useful to think of the Arctic as a northern extension of the heartland that is not truly sea, though we see it, of course, as being sea on our maps. Just another aspect, I think, that got left out that, as I said, we don't have to go into, but it's worth thinking about in the future.
Well, very interestingly, and why did Peter the Great fund the expeditions of Bering? It was to colonize Hyperborea. It was to colonize the Arctic as if it were Australia, thinking that it would be a effective and prosperous colony. So this idea of dominating the Arctic as an extension of the Russian heartland, i.e. Hyperborea, that's the reason why Russian expansionism went the way of Alaska, effectively, by that same logic, expanding out across the Arctic. So this has been a core component of Russian thinking since Peter the Great. This isn't that isn't a novel suggestion. I think the reason that someone like Mackinder pushes back against this is the idea of its lack of the inability to navigate it effectively. But as we see with the creation of, from Russia's point of view, the modern Northern Fleet, the submarine fleet, that really isn't the case anymore. And of course, Trump may receive a lot of pushback from annexing things, desiring to annex things like Greenland. But from that point of view, there is a definite logic behind it, especially if Trump had any intention of rowing back NATO, which ultimately I don't believe he will. But regardless, another point to make, which is really pedantic, but it actually reinforces your point about everything is warfare, is to think about international law. The whole basis of our legal system is just a verbal incarnation of trial by combat. That's essentially all it is. It's just another arena from which to combat your enemies and win various battlegrounds. To answer this, because this is irritating me, in World War One, Russia basically forced Germany into a position where it had to attack, because Russia had mobilized its armed forces secretly for the sake of aiding the Serbs and their aggressive posture, basically as a Slavic Piedmont in the Balkans, which was the assumption of all of the thinking of the Austrian General Staff under Herzendorf. In World War II, the Soviet Union attacked as many countries as Germany. That's an established fact. And as we now know, the military thinking, the military posture of the Red Army during 1941 had assumed an offensive posture and not a defensive posture. It was simply a case of Germany attacking first. So, it's a Bismarckian adage, effectively, always allow for your enemy to declare war on you. In the case of Germany, they failed to do that, which is why essentially Russia gets away with that. Anyway.
One quick thing to add on that Arctic thing very, very quickly. That is a domain in which we should expect to see aggressive expansion by Russia with the participation of China. And because we think of it as empty sea, we think of it as the domain of the sea powers and not a part of the heartland, but because surface fleets are very limited in how it can be navigated, it is in some respects a land power because it's covered in ice, even though it has submarines underneath it. Also, by expanding in that direction, it is a domain of warfare that we're not going to think about politically and see in the newspapers the same way with, for example, this population or this nation or state falling under the influence of Russia. So it's not a situation where they will be aggressively expansionist or could be aggressively expansionist into populated areas, but it's extremely important because if you look at a polar projection, you will see how short the distance is between the new world and the old. Given the types of map projections we look at, we tend to miss that. But also it gives them all the bang of mineral and energy resources and new trade lanes if the climate does change, as it has been changing somewhat, and they increase their icebreaker fleet. So that's another area that is a part of the heartland that isn't truly sea or land, into which Russia can aggressively push. And I think we'll see that. I just wanted to throw that in because I wasn't sure I really made it clear with the first statement.
I think it's interesting because what we're seeing is the rimland expanding in the north to encompass like the North Pole, or at least half of it. And it is interesting that Trump, so Donald Trump, a lot of people think he's a bit of a buffoon, and he's been laughed at that he actually said that he wants to annex Canada, today, and Greenland. And you just think it's interesting because when people like us look at heartland theory, we can kind of see the logic in that, but for most people, it's Trump being crazy. It's Trump just being illogical and foolish, or he wants to create this giant American empire that Semyagog was alluding to earlier. But there is a kind of logic to it. It does make sense. but the thing is, we would end up, especially if you add in this kind of isolationist move in America. It's sort of like, the problem is, of course, you've got a democracy, and we don't know where that's going to be in 4 years. But assuming this is a sort of trend that's going to set in with America, where American power is declining, they look to consolidate in their own hemisphere and across the. It does make perfect sense that we're going to take as much as we can get and then hunker down in our own continent. And in that scenario, the situation for Europe is even more dire, because then we are left. And I don't want to keep bringing this up, but I'm just so suspicious when people say, "Well, you'll be all right. All they want to do is trade," because then you're left in a position where you've alienated the heartland. You've annoyed and alienated everybody around you, and you're just this aging, sort of decrepit peninsula, disarmed. And even your sugar daddy has decided that he's going home and locking up shop into this kind of George Orwell 3 power, Orwell 2 power situation of 3 grand sort of civilizational states. And Europe's position in that is absolutely dire. And this is what concerns me. But yeah, there's definitely a logic to what Trump's saying. And you think, when you look at some of the people who are sort of leading foreign policy, they do seem not very bright. Now, I wouldn't expect. Has Donald Trump sat down and read Heartland Theory and then sort of looked at toward the future, or because I would expect, funny enough, that somebody who was regarded as like this insane hawk on Ukraine, Boris Johnson, I actually think Boris Johnson will have read Mackinder. I actually think he will be known of this, even though he comes across as a buffoon. He's very sort of highly educated. But the problem with the kind of pop social media politics is that everything is in the here and now, and grand strategy seems almost ridiculous and absurd. And this is how Trump comes across to like normal everyday liberals and the masses when he talks like this. But there's definitely a logic behind it.
I mean, just one thing to refer to. You said implicitly the idea of America as sugar daddy, just to reinforce that. Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands and current Secretary General of NATO, in the last NATO conference,
Yes,
literally called Trump daddy.
literally. That's pathetic. That's absolutely pathetic.
Many
So,
such cases.
well, I mean, one thing that Putin and Xi Jinping of China have an advantage of, where Trump does not, is that Trump is ultimately bound by term limits. So he can't force a posture within America to the extent that Putin can, who has basically been in charge of Russia since 1999, even though we had the Medvedev blip from 2008 up until 2012. So even if he were to inject a bit of Mackinder-esque, realpolitik in this, in some cases there is definite continuity in the US State Department, but if Trump tries to generally innovate, it will just appear like schizophrenia, which I think is the common assumption that we have among so much of Trump's policies, especially if you look at his posts during the quote unquote 12 days war. And as for strategic thinking among European leaders, um, I mean, it's not even to say there isn't any. I think it would be assumed that there is a chasm, there is a void, there is antimatter, where there should be strategic thinking regarding Europe. So it's almost a nonsense to even trying to engage with it on that level. All right, there's a last point I wanted to bring up, which is so much of Mackinder. There are two points I wanted to bring up just quickly. I started this talk by talking about Mackinder viewing this as the end of the Columbian epoch. Well, ironically, what you've been mentioning, Semigog, regarding the expansion up into the Arctic, actually would conflict with that and reinforce it, strangely enough. It would conflict with it in the sense that what Mackinder assumed to be a world system, whereby he could predict the geographic pivot coming from Russia, is actually being turned on its head by the fact that no, there are still areas to explore due to changes in climate and innovations in technology. Yet it would also reinforce his original point, the centrality of Eurasia, due to what we consider to be the accessibility and the interconnectivity of the world island. Just one point. But the final point I want to make is regarding this whole notion of historical determinism derived from geography. Obviously, I've talked about so much history where I do not believe that is the case at all. You can look at civilizations which have terrible geographic positions who are able to excel given their meager resources, and then countries with abundance that ultimately end up doing nothing. I guess the last thing I really want to sort of unpack here is how viable really is geographic determinism as a mechanism. I mean, we can look all the way back to figures like Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz in the early 18th century, advocating that France should conquer Egypt for the reasons that became blatantly obvious to Napoleon, and why Napoleon III funded the construction of the Suez Canal. Or we can look to someone like Montesquieu and the Spirit of Laws, all echoing these similar thoughts regarding the geographic determinism of various cultures and civilizations. But do you think there is still a possibility in Mackinder's worldview, if we accept so many of the precepts that we brought up and unpacked, that a country with very limited resources that would appear on the surface to have very little going for it can upend this whole system and defy this geographic determinism?
Well, rephrase the central question for me. Upend the determinism.
Well, like I said, so much of Mackinder is predicated on geographic determinism, i.e., in the closed geographic system, we can look at the world island and we look at Russia and say, this is the reality, this is going to be the future, the pivot towards the domination of the heartland. Do we all agree with that, or do we concede that, given the whole sort of history of civilizations and given how civilizations have emerged in awful starting points which aren't predicated on geography, is there still room for a view of geopolitics which isn't entirely determined by geography, as Mackinder would have us believe?
Well, the quick answer I would say, and thank you, and sorry I didn't follow it initially. Yes, I believe so. Though some of these thinkers, like Speakman, acknowledged the importance of air power, and he saw, so far as I understand it, the atmosphere as another kind of sea, in terms of wrapped around the entire world, and how flights can cross over mountains and forests and ravines and things without any trouble. So technologically, I think there are ways in which major shifts could happen in the disposition of the powers and the dynamics between them. And there is also the idea, the sort of wild card of human notions regarding organization. We're so far from the period of Jesus or of Muhammad, things like this, or the Buddha, that we tend to dismiss, or well, let's not say dismiss, but we do not reckon in our thinking with the possibility of a great religious eruption into human consciousness, and how that could shape behaviors. We're so distant from it in time that we simply don't add it to our calculations of possibilities.
Well, it's interesting you mention Mohammedism in particular, because of course, Mackinder's great contention is that yes, Muhammad was able to act as this religious, nationalistic, unifying figure towards the Arab tribes, but they had been blessed by geography had they achieved this unity in the first place. So again, everything is still subordinated to this idea of geographic determinism. I think, again, if I were to look at one country that historically would seem to have everything, going against it, but ultimately was able to buck the trend. It's not Britain, it's perhaps the Netherlands or someone like Portugal. But I think in the modern case, there are two very, very disparate examples that I'm going to bring up. One is North Korea, and the other is Israel. Two countries, Israel we refer to obviously quite extensively, but North Korea again. North Korea, very little in the way of natural resources, occupies the poorer, less populated part of a divided peninsula, and yet, due to its possession of nuclear weapons and its missile technology, it's basically able to assert itself as a sovereign state in a way that would, say, for example, be incomparable with a country of equivalent size in Europe. Let's take, say, for example, Romania, in terms of population size. If we're going to look at countries that have an overall impression on world affairs, you're going to say North Korea has much more so than, say, for example, somewhere like Romania. And then Israel. Israel has none of the advantages that the Heartland has. It doesn't have any strategic depth. It barely has any natural resources. It barely has any naturally defensive frontiers, which is why it's constantly engaged in these preemptive strikes against all of its neighbors. And yet, it is arguably one of the most powerful countries in the world for reasons which are completely anti-geographical, but for reasons we can't really get that much into without this stream and probably my channel being banned.
Yes, that's the diaspora population aspect, which is fundamentally deterritorialized. As you said, we don't need to get into it, but that's an entire angle that I haven't read much of Mackinder. As I said, I'm familiar with it. I've read that 1904 paper, but if you look at these minority outgroups that have been considered in the past, certainly in our circles, whether they be Parsis or Armenians or Jews, and you think about financial power and global networks. Here you have deterritorialized loci, to whatever extent you can talk about a deterritorialized locus of influence. And that is something that sits apart from this map of geographic determinism. And I think that's a very interesting thing you brought up there, because we should think about it. It stands outside of frontiers and borders and operates. It's almost like you think about biological development, evolution, and that's the solid sort of materialistic or material layer of that process. And then you superimpose upon that human culture as an additional dimension in which a kind of development or evolution, in the best of cases, quite the opposite in other cases, can take place.
I mean, I would say this is going to annoy everybody in the chat, but there is actually a certain logic to the incessant sort of propaganda about green energy and solar panels and the Agenda 2030, in that if it could work, if you look, I mean, Germany would be the most acute sort of example of this, is that if the Germans could actually power all of their chemical plants and their industry and their car plants on solar energy, wind and waves, then they would actually be independent. And it's become one of those things which is sort of libtard coded within right-wing circles, where we immediately just throw out the idea that we should be sort of energy independent. And you can see that nobody went in harder on that gambit than Germany. And it's almost as if within the German state, after the Nord Stream got blown up and they were cut off from Russian supplies, it was almost as if, well, it doesn't matter that much because we can use solar energy and we can use wind and waves. Now, I don't think that's worked, and it doesn't seem to be working anywhere else. But in theory, there is a logic to it.
Well, you see, I would agree with you if they hadn't shut down their nuclear power plants.
Again, yeah.
And to me, that just makes me think that no, this is sabotage.
Yeah.
Not the opposite. And Semigog brought up a very, very interesting point about Iran's nuclear enrichment program recently, which is this notion that if we're going to look at, again, geographic determinism, the problem with Iran is that despite its nominal fortress frontiers, i.e. the mountains on its various frontiers, the area which is most oil rich on the Persian Gulf is very susceptible to attack. Ergo, having enriched uranium facilities with the capacity for generating nuclear power would basically act as that sovereign guarantee if the frontier regions were attacked in the way that they were for, say, for example, I don't know, Arab irredentist goals in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. I hope I'm not taking words out of your mouth, Semigog, but in essence, it follows the same argument that pursuing these energy policies are a way of attaining sovereignty.
Yeah, that certainly fits with the picture. Energy is, this is one of the key issues in terms of the geographic determinism, access to energy. As you were talking about earlier, Germany had to turn it up to 11 and head into Russia pretty quickly because Germany just doesn't have resources of that sort. They were trying to get into the Caucasus and Azerbaijan early on in World War II, driving in that direction because they had to secure some source of fuel. So energy resources are, of course, central to this discussion, central to the Great Game, central to discussion of choke points, for oil tankers and the routes that are chosen for pipelines and whether or not those particular routes can be destabilized, making them as logistical corridors simply, unfeasible. So yeah, there is that. And in terms of more general ideas, this is not related to the previous point, but I just wanted to throw it in since we're wrapping up. It's really interesting to me that in terms of the great geopolitical thinkers, there's really just the North Atlantic school of Mahan and Mackinder. And then there's the German school, Ritter and Ratzel and Haushofer and Ratzel's student, the Swede, Kjellin. So there's basically the German school of geopolitics and the Anglo-American one. And I just did a little bit of due diligence. This is not my domain. I don't read in French or in Russian or anything. So, forgive me. But from what I could tell using some LLMs and then checking on it, the French had a few thinkers, but none of them rose to the level of a Mahan or a Mackinder. The Russians, apparently, Dugin is their great geopolitical thinker and of recent vintage. I'm not saying that they didn't produce papers and develop strategy, but in terms of a public thinker of standing that has contributed to how we think about geopolitics, it's just the Germans and the Anglo-Americans. I think that's very interesting.
I mean, in fairness to the French, the issue, say, for example, that Braudel has is in the limitations of being able to strategize things if you conceive of history as a longue durée, which isn't a history of events, so to speak. So the implication regarding the French, you can say, geographic school of history versus someone like a Mahan or a Mackinder is more philosophical. It was less so that there was this, ironically, thinking you would think there must be a French school of realpolitics, which is based basically on the restitution of Alsace-Lorraine and the destruction of Germany. But yes, interesting enough, it's not just also that there are German and American thinkers, is that so much of German realpolitik is also derivative of those original American English thinkers, often taking, like with Haushofer, the arguments which were intended to conceive of a German anti-British strategy and then employing them for the exact reasons, essentially, that the British were conceiving of the strategies to oppose them in the first place, which I find quite interesting. But anyway, I'm going to start reading through the super chats. Morgoth, anything you just sort of wanted to say in conclusion?
I was just going to say on the idea of strategic thinkers, I've got something waiting in my sort of to read box, which is called The Strategic Consequences of Chinese Racism, a Strategic Asymmetry for the United States, which is a sort of a deep state thing that was produced in 2013 by the American deep state. And it actually gets into Chinese attitudes towards cultural aspects in the West and within China. And they're basically, I mean, it says here, modern Chinese views on race, Yan Fu's racist views, Liang Chi-Kao, Sun Yat-sen's racial views. Now, the point here is I'm not trying to be a kind of edgelord, but this is an analysis. It's a American sort of deep state analysis of how the Chinese are analyzing America, and they're looking at the weaknesses of America. And yet, what's crazy is that what they're highlighting are what in the West are perceived as strengths. And so you can see that the Chinese have a deep state, and they've kind of flipped it over, and they've said what we think of as strengths are actually weaknesses. And of course, because they don't suffer under political correctness, it's going to be a very spicy read. I think that's and so all of this is baked into long-term strategic thinking of other countries, because they're not hamstrung by, just to sort of bring it full circle, with this idea of the waves and the sea being this inherently sort of liberal, progressive impulse. Maybe that is actually not only true, but going to bring down the West.
And I should add, there is a great strategic thinker from China, and that's Sun Tzu. And it's absolutely absurd not to include him, because he, of course, talks about terrain, as one of the aspects or dimensions of warfare that that people should that generals should consider. And as if you look at the unrestricted warfare papers that have been translated into English, it's immediately apparent that it's simply the bringing of Sun Tzu's Art of War down to date, as Mark Twain would have sarcastically referred to it, as opposed to bringing it up to date. There's a kind of degeneration there. And as my old friend Tim used to point out, the Tao is like the book of theory, and the Art of War is simply the application of the Tao to circumstance, and all is imagined as war. So that's an important correction, I should add. There is indeed a world famous, ancient, and extensive tradition of strategy that certainly can be applied to geopolitics, and the Chinese have it.
Well, we can definitely extend this list. I think you're referencing the founders of quote-unquote geopolitics around the turn of the 20th century. Yeah, around the time that Emil Reich coined the term. I think it was in 1902. Otherwise, we can draw on an extensive well of strategic thinking. Coney current year for £5, thank you. Is Constantinople, Istanbul, the most strategically important city on Earth? If not, which do you think the area is? And does it lie in the pivot area? Well, the significance of Constantinople, beyond its religious and its cultural significance, is that it determines access into the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Thereby, if the Russians could control it and control access from the Black Sea through the Dardanelles Straits into the Aegean, they could potentially upset passage of maritime commerce and navies through the Suez Canal. That's in the modern context rather than looking at a historical context. In a historical context, Constantinople was selected by Constantine in the 4th century because it provided a strong defensible position from sea, combined with almost impassable walls, the Theodosian walls, by which the emperor,
natural harbor,
a perfect natural harbor in the Golden Horn, by which the emperor could have easy proximity to the frontiers on the Danube and the frontiers on the Euphrates. If you combine that to a heartland view, like I said, it could have proved a major blow to French and British interests in the 19th century, and by extension, Italian interests, and obviously Ottoman interests. I mean, the loss of Constantinople, I think, in the 19th century, if you look at the rise of Muhammad Ali Pasha, could have hastened the collapse of the Ottoman Empire by decades further than what we saw historically. So it is definitely, I think it's possible that it's the most strategically important city in Eastern Europe and possibly in the Mediterranean. I'm not sure about the world. What do you guys think?
Singapore.
Yeah, the Straits of Malacca basically obviously control access between the Sea of China and the Indian Ocean. I suppose, unlike what we see with Constantinople, you can circumvent Singapore by going all the way around Sumatra and by Java, or sort of even going through Australia. I think the significance of Constantinople is that it is literally the only gateway to and from the Black Sea. Morgoth?
Sorry, I've got nothing to add.
Darth Kilhoun for $5. But yes, I think the Straits of Malacca are another good contender on the list in terms of a general pivot area. Darth Kilhoun for $5. Started the stream while in mass. Now have a catch up. AM, Morgoth, and Semigog all in one stream. This is going to be great. Here's my tithe. Well, thank you very much, Darth Kilhoun. Brozu Ufso for $50. That's very generous. Thank you. Finding Quarter Stream Live. Thank you and your guests for consistently level, erudite, and articulate videos. Well, thank you very much, Brozu Ufso. That's a very kind and generous super chat. All right. Do either of you have any projects in the works or anything you would like to say before we leave?
I just had a video up the other day where I was analysing a rather bleak assessment of modern day Britain using Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and No Country for Old Men. And I'll be having a new article up on the Substack soon.
Fantastic. Semigog.
For me, I have nothing immediately upcoming in terms of videos. I hope everyone will follow me over on X or Twitter or whatever. And I now have a Substack called the Royal Book of Spiritual Chivalry. And there are a few essays posted on it. One is a two-part one, defending the conspiratard. I think the conspiratard mindset is fundamentally well, I mean, geopolitics is basically, one of the playgrounds of the conspiratard, as well as all power politics. So I think this unjustly maligned figure, the so-called conspiratard, instead should be defended, deserves to be defended. There's also another essay on there called the Borderlands. So I hope everyone will check out my Substack and consider subscribing. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you very much, AM. And good to be with you. Good to talk to you, Morgoth. Thanks, gents.
I think just one thing on that, another question, maybe something we haven't really mentioned as much again, but by way of extension of Iran, the Straits of Hormuz, especially given the strategic significance of the Persian Gulf, I think can't be discounted as a major geographic area of strategic value. Other than that, thank you both so much for coming on. I recommend both of your YouTube channels and your Substacks profusely. And just thank you everyone for listening, and I'll see you again soon. As for content on this channel, I hope at some point, make no promises, to be following this up with a talk on Russian nationalism, on Eurasianism in particular. And I was actually hoping on following that up, possibly with Semigog, with a History of Today episode talking about Eurasianism and Third Worldism. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about geography in this episode, so this would instead focus on Soviet-era policies about decolonization and things like that, and how that can help us properly appraise the strategic view of today. So other than that, thank you again, everyone, for listening, and good night.